Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the final day of Developer Week 2024. I have our first speaker of the day. This is Gregory Koberger, the CEO with README. Gregory, take it away.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. So as you can see on the screen, this talk is a little interactive. It doesn't have to be if you don't want to, but if you want to play along, you can go to readme.dev, and the screen will change and stuff, and things will pop up in a few minutes as we go through things. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or anything like that. There's not too many people here, so we should be able to make it a little more interactive. But yeah, welcome to my talk. So like Austin said, my name is Greg. I'm the founder of README. We do API documentation, so I'll be a little biased during this talk, but I want to talk about how to make APIs easier to use. So while I'm talking for the first few minutes, feel free to go to readme.dev to get set up. But when people build an API, there tends to be two different ways that people build an API. The first is they know they need an API. So what they do is they have an engineer someplace, just kind of take a quick crack at it. Maybe it takes a day or two. APIs aren't particularly hard to build, especially if you already have a website going and all that. So you spend a few days on the API, you get it out there, and maybe people start to use it. The other way that people do it is they design ahead of time. They spend weeks and weeks planning out, building out OAS specs, like, working between teams, having like governance internally, smart contracts and stuff like that. But either way, the way it works is that you release into the wild, and best case scenario, people start to use it early on. And while that's really great, there's something unique about APIs that are different between APIs and regular websites. On a regular website or app or something like that, if something's not working, you can iterate, you can tweak, you can see, okay, this isn't going great. What if we move the button over here to the left, stuff like that. But APIs are different. The problem with APIs is once it's out there and once one or two people are integrating with it, you can't change anything because, the computer, like their computer is sending stuff and expecting exact rigid stuff back. And you're kind of backed into this corner where even if you realize that you were wrong about something early on or you want to improve, you can create a new version. You can do some things where you tweak things and layer stuff on. But for the most part, you're pretty stuck with the API. You can't make any breaking changes, and you have to support it forever. And if you don't want to support it, you have to either hurt your customers by turning off an old version, or you have to migrate them somehow, or it's a ton of work. So it's really hard to keep your API kind of evolving and changing over the years like you would with a website. So that's why I'm calling my talk, Faking It, How to Improve Your API Without Actually Improving It. So what I'm going to talk about here is I'm going to walk through some things you can do to make your API go from kind of hard to use and really not that great to being a stellar API without actually touching the API itself. Because again, like I said, once it's out there, it's really hard to iterate on the API and change it and make changes. So we're going to find some cheat codes to make a really great API without actually having to touch the API itself. So yes, we're going to go through some ways to fake it. So when I started learning how to program, I learned from a book like this, and it's just a normal book. It's paragraphs of text, some diagrams, stuff like that. It's organized into chapters, and there's a lot of issues with books like this. I love them, but they don't know who the user is. So if you and I were to go to a bookstore and buy the exact same book, we would get obviously the exact same book, and it doesn't know who's written APIs before, who hasn't. It has no way of knowing what's going on. Everyone just gets the same exact thing, so the audience has to be for everyone. So then we went online. We started to move documentation from books like this online to websites like this. And really all we did was we kind of just took the same paragraphs of text and put them on the website. We didn't really innovate that much. We have a sidebar with pages and categories, which is basically just chapters and pages. We still really lean on paragraphs of text pretty heavily in documentation. And we do basically the same stuff that you would do for a book. We just put it online and made it so you can access it with the URL. I want to talk a little bit today about how we can kind of shift that away from seeing documentation as really just a digital version of an analog book and focus a little more on what can we do to make documentation the UI, UX for your API? Because when people think about an API, like if you close your eyes and think about your favorite API, I know it's kind of weird, but first of all, you're probably thinking of Stripe or Twilio. But if you think about your favorite API, you're probably not thinking about JSON blobs being or anything like that. You're probably thinking about the documentation, because that's kind of how you actually learn the API, interact with it when you're getting started, things like that. So taking looking at documentation is less of here, let's just write a bunch of stuff down and throw it over the wall and let the developer figure it out, and showing rather than telling is going to be a huge part of what we're talking about today. So one of the important things is that nobody cares about your API. I know that sounds kind of not that fun because you put a lot of time and effort into the API, but very few APIs ever get to the point where people like are excited about them or care about them, or like when they wake up in the morning, what they want to do is they want to use your API. What they actually want to do is they want to do something, because behind every API call is a person trying to do something, and they want to get back to their lives. They want their boss to be happy with them. They want to accomplish something. So it's not that they don't want to use your API. They definitely do, but they don't want to spend hours and hours like learning your API and understanding all the differences and nuances and all that, because they're literally trying to do something so they can get back to their families or their lives or whatever they happen to be doing. So if you approach it with that mindset, which is that like no one really cares about your API, you start to think about things very differently. The usability kind of comes into focus where you're like, okay, I need to like really focus on making it easy to use, friendly, and all that. And the goal for all documentation or all APIs is getting to people to their first 200 as quickly as possible. So 200 in API parlance is a successful call. There's a few other ones that are similar, but like basically a 200 is, this means that things worked. And your goal is to get them from, I want to use this API to a 200 as quickly as humanly possible. So we're gonna go over some tricks and tips or so to get from that like, oh no, I've never used the API before, to like, okay, I've made a successful call. So what we're going to do is, this is where the interactive part first comes in. So if you are on readme.dev, in a second, and if you're not on it, don't worry, you can still watch my screen. I'll kind of go through it as well and show you what everyone else is looking at. But in a second, I'm going to hit next, and your screen is going to change, and you're going to see some documentation. So this documentation is very similar to the documentation I was talking about before. It's paragraphs of text. It's kind of written like a book. I'll talk about that in a second, what I mean by that. And every single thing that's good or bad about the API is something that I've seen numerous times in other documentation. Now, just to give you a fair warning, I'm going to give like about a minute or two to go through this. It's not going to be easy. It's kind of the point, but it's pretty standard API documentation. I haven't done anything too tricky in it, but we're going to see if anyone can make an API request. So here we go.
All right, so this was an interactive talk. You're not going to be able to follow along, so I'm going to do it live for you. Now, remember, the whole point of this is that it's not going to go well, but I'm going to show you what normal docs kind of look like as I play through with it. So if you were in the talk, you would see something similar to this, and you'd be trying to make an API request, while on the main screen, there was a way to show who is the first person, a leaderboard to show who's the first person to make a request. So you're here and you're like, okay, I need to make a request to this. It's a post to /message. What does that mean? Where do I go? So there's nothing on this page. So I'm going to go to look around, getting started. Here's some stuff about REST. Okay, here's a URL. I'll use this one. Okay, so now I can get started. So then I'm going to do a curl this URL /message. Okay. I'm missing a content type. Okay, so how do I do that? So I did see something back here. Okay, content type. How do I send this in curl? I don't know. So I'm going to do a curl headers and see what comes up. Okay, so I can click in here. I'm already off the dock, so I'm off on a different place now trying to figure this out. Okay, so I can do -h. So similar to this, so I'll copy and paste this. But I actually need the content type, so I'll copy and paste this. Okay, so, I'm missing an API key. So I go back to here, and nothing about an API key. Authentication, that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to go through here. Here's what the API key could look like. This is a fake API key, though. So where do I go for the real API key? Use an API key. Okay, so I read through all of this, and I see that, I can get my API key if I go to the dashboard. Where's the dashboard? Okay, here we go. So I go into here. Now I'll actually do this pretty quickly because I know what I'm doing because I've made the site. But see I'm bouncing around trying to find all this information. Okay, so I have my API key. How do I send it in? This is in Python. I'm writing curl. I need a base 64 encode this. I don't know how to do that, so I guess I have to like Google base 64 encode. Okay, so I can take this, but then I have to do colon in here for the. Okay, so. API keys first. Okay, so in theory I can go like this and then encode it, and then I can copy and paste this and come back here. Okay, so then I need to do authorization. Okay, so then I do because I see that I have to do this. Okay, my API key is incorrect. Why is it incorrect? I think I did it right, but I'm trying to read this with the colon. Anyway, so you get back to here, and we haven't even gotten a basic API request made, let alone figure out how the body params all work. This is an array of objects, which is kind of confusing to figure out how to like implement. There's a type. we're going to find out, if we kept going on this, we'd find out that the type, if you go into the message object up here, you realize that the type is a enum for SE3 request to response, but it doesn't say anything here. So basically, the whole point is that I've been jumping around these docs and I can't make an API request because it's kind of like an escape room where I'm jumping around and I can't find anything because all the information is spread out, a combination between all these docs, and also I have to Google and find things. So anyway, that's what you would have seen if you're playing along at home. But back to the regularly scheduled talk.
So first is we want to treat each endpoint each page as an entry point. So in a book, you kind of are constrained by pages of text. Whoops, people can't see the wrong screen. Sorry about that. My first time using Ring Central. Okay, so first is treat each page as an entry point. So when you have a book, you are constrained by how much content you can put in there. Like you can't make it 100,000 pages or anything like that, and you have to structure things in a way where you don't repeat yourself because you can't waste a bunch of ink on it. So when you use a website, though, you don't really think of it that way. Like you can use the same content over and over again. You don't have to worry about constraints like that. So one problem I see a lot of times in documentation is if you look at the top here, the URL. I'm going to circle it here. That information's not here. Like that information's hidden in the getting started guide, like where to get the full URL and stuff like that. API keys are hidden in the authentication section or in the dashboard. Everything's kind of all over the map. And it feels a little bit like an escape room as you're going through it, where you're trying to find all the different things you need to make this API request. And you're going to like the authentication page to get your API keys. You're going to the getting started page to figure out like what formats and how to send your API key, or what the base URL is, the sandbox URL or something like that. So one of the easiest things you can do is just make sure that every single page knows that this could and should be the first page that a user ends on. It should have all the information embedded in it. And once you start realizing this and going to API docs, you'll start to notice like people all the time forget to do this. They assume that you are going to read the docs from start to finish like you would a book, and not that you're going to jump around and use each endpoint as an entry point. So that's the first thing. Second thing as a takeaway is we're going to show rather than tell. So documentation should be interactive. It's a website. You can click around, you can play with stuff, things like that. But when you're building documentation, you shouldn't put the onus on the user to figure things out or have to use Postman or something like that. Like make the API documentation actually interactive. So here's an example of that. So here's the documentation we had. It's not bad documentation. This is pretty standard documentation that you'd see. But if you note, there's no code on here. So everyone's expected to take it from their language and translate it, or take it from English and translate it into whatever programming language it is. And code is very deterministic, whereas English is very kind of like much less so. So we're basically taking code snippets and then we're writing out documentation in plain English, and then we're expecting people to translate that back into code. And no wonder people get really frustrated and keep hitting walls and have a lot of troubles with stuff like that. So the number one cheat code that you could do, if you listen to nothing else in this talk except for just this, it's adding code snippets to your docs. And the reason is all of a sudden it takes this ambiguity of like, okay, I need to it says like encode blah, blah, blah. Like rather than taking that ambiguity in English, you can actually see it and understand and copy and paste it without having to go through the trouble of compiling a code snippet yourself. Like think about how annoying it is to write out code snippets for your docs. It's super, super, super annoying. Because you have to like go through and like write out a bunch of code snippets, but it's just as annoying, if not more so, for your users, because first of all, they don't know your API, they know nothing about it, so they're trying to figure it out themselves. So you know way more than they do. But the second problem is they have to do it over and over again. So like, if you have 1,000 users, that means 1,000 people just spent time translating the English and the documentation into code snippets, whereas you could do it once or twice or 3 times and then save people a ton of time. Another thing is different languages. I see that a lot of APIs tend to have 1 language or 2 if they do have code snippets, but people use thousands and thousands of different languages. I have 5 here, but like on README, you can get by default about 200 different languages or targets. And the different languages, each have different nuances. So for example, JavaScript, maybe it's jQuery, maybe it's React, stuff like that. In Node, there's 4 or 5 different libraries that people can use to make API requests, things like that. So back to the code snippets. One thing that I don't like about this code snippet right here, this is a Python code snippet, is that it's kind of long and kind of clunky. There's a lot of plumbing that you see. You see like the URL, which is fine. You see like content type and authorization, stuff like that. You see it's just very kind of clunky and stuff like this. And a lot of the hard work is done there. And like, if you're reading over this, it's really not obvious what's going on here. If you're reading the code in the code base later on. So another thing that you can do that's really, really great is SDKs. Look how quickly, we made the SDK work, and it's teeny tiny little code snippet, and it's very easy to understand what's going on. We're sending a message, and we see the messages in there. So that makes it super easy for the user, both when they're implementing and also when they're looking at a code snippet. So the nice thing about SDKs too is they don't have to be one-to-one with the API, meaning that if you start to feel like, oh, okay, V1 of the API is a little outdated, like there's things I want to change, you can keep iterating on the SDK, make the SDK easier to use, and use that as a layer between the API and the user to smooth things over and simplify. I'm gonna take a quick break and check the chat. Okay, nothing in the chat. So I'll keep going. Okay. So then we get to this. So we have the SDKs. The third thing you can do is let people actually play around inline. So the way that a lot of people try to use an API is they're going to take all the information from your docs, and then they move it over someplace else, whether it be Postman or the CLI or actual code. But what that does is that means that you have to kind of like copy and paste, and keep trying. And like, that's a big jump from documentation to like making a successful call. So one thing I really love is documentation that lets you play around with it right in the documentation, as opposed to having to like go someplace else and spin up a server or anything like that. So if you see here, like I've built this, like I've had these like little things, so I can do like hello, and you see how it like changes the message over on the right side. So what I'm doing right here is I'm actually like kind of changing the API request right here within the bounds. Like I can't make a bad request because I'm being kind of constricted into only valid stuff. And if I hit try it now, there we go, it succeeds. And you can actually try and play around in the docs. So I just made my first 200 call pretty easily without having to leave the docs, and I'm sure that it works. I know my API key worked. I know that everything's configured. I know the values that's in are good. Obviously, it'll take a little bit of tweaking once you get into the code, but I've kind of got to the point where I know that everything's basically working, because when you're building a good developer experience, you don't want there to be a gigantic leap. Like traditionally, bad DX, the way it works is you start from like nothing until you get to something really successful. And it's a gigantic leap. And you don't know if you're being led astray. You don't know if you're wrong or anything like that until you've actually made a successful call. You don't know how close you are, how far away you are, stuff like that. So kind of making these like tiny little jumps where, okay, I just made a successful call inside the docs. So now it's a lot easier for me to make a successful call outside the docs because I've already been successful here. Third is knowing what each developer is doing. So everything we said before is interactive, showing rather than telling, stuff like that. But for demonstration purposes, I kept it to just generic stuff that anyone can play around with. But think about like when you open your phone and you use Instagram. You open it up and like, let's say that, a month ago, a friend talked about like, why and buy a pineapple. Like you open up Instagram and all of a sudden you see like someone's trying to sell you a pineapple. Like Instagram and every single website on the internet or app knows exactly who you are, what's going on with you, and tailors the content directly to you, and works really hard. That being said, when you go to API documentation, it tends to not know or care who the end user is. So, oops, something just rang. Let's see what that was. Oh, I got a message. Okay, Rachel, I'll come back to this. Same with like a book, if you were to like open up a book, we'd all see the exact same thing. It makes no sense that everyone sees the exact same thing when they're using API documentation, because let's say it's my first time using an API. I want a getting started guide. I want to get my API keys. I want to kind of make my first 200 call and like, make sure everything's going. I want to make sure the API is even good for me. But if it's my 500th time on the docs and like everything's down and my boss is mad at me and I'm freaking out because I'm not sure what's going on and what's wrong, I definitely don't want to see the same, cute getting started guide or marketing page or stuff like that. I want to actually know what's going on and start to debug it. So I'm going to talk for a few seconds here about like how you can kind of shift your docs away from just being like documentation and be a lot closer to actually knowing who the user is and giving them an experience that's tailored to them. So the first is API keys. Most documentation, and it didn't work before, but if you had seen the old docs, you would have seen like it told the documentation was like, okay, to get your API key, you go to the dashboard and blah, blah, blah. And it's super annoying. Why not just show the API keys right in the docs? So have an authentication page that doesn't just tell you how to get the API key, but actually shows you the API key and lets you manage the API key right in the documentation. And then in the code snippets, like keep the API key, right there, so they don't have to like hunt around for the API key. Remember I said before, every page should be, every page should be an entry point for the docs. Like each page should have the API keys on it, should have everything you need to get started. But don't tell people to go someplace else to get the API key, like put it right there, because why wouldn't we do that? Next up is API logs. You don't really need this, but if you think about how APIs work, there's really two different situations where two different ways you interact with an API. The first is you're implementing it for the first time ever, and it's a human being kind of hitting go and getting an error back, hitting go, getting an error back, hitting go, getting success back, and like you kind of like can iterate and change and figure it out. But once it's on the server someplace, which is where most APIs run, you really don't have that back and forth. It's a computer talking to a computer back and forth, and there's no real way to understand what's going on. So like, yeah, you can definitely add something like logging, or so the end users, the onus can be on them to like set up Sentry and watch for errors and report them back and stuff like that. But when users freaking out, like why not do that for them? Why not in your docs, like add, so you see in the bottom, I add like I add a little recent request thing. Where you can actually see in the docs the logs themselves and know what's going on and see successes and errors and dig into them and copy and paste the URL and send it to support and say, hey, this isn't working. How can you help me out? Things like that. Just by layering real-time logs and API keys on top of the docs, all of a sudden the docs transform into like a generic, book-like thing and way more into something interactive where people can debug and figure things out and ask for support and ask for help and things like that. So anything you can do to kind of make the API docs know who the user is and show them, the information they're actually looking for, as opposed to like paragraphs of text that are like, well, maybe the problem is this, or maybe the problem is this, is really great. All right, I'm going to pause here again and switch over to Rachel's question. So Rachel asked, how did you add the SDK code to the experience? Did you generate it with README or externally somehow? Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna start by saying I don't want to talk too much about README because I think that whether you use README or not, all these are really good things to do. And there's no reason you have to use README for anything I just talked about. Everything here is something that you can do with building yourself. There's other platforms out there, I suppose, stuff like that. That being said, for the SDK code, README does automatically generate an SDK for you. A few years ago, I bought the word API from a bunch of places in like Node and Python and all that. So it looks very white labeled, and you can just like API, you just require API in Node or Python, whatever. And like we take care of all that for you. There's no work involved. So README builds out the SDKs for you. There's a bunch of other companies. If you Google like, SDK generation, you can either build it yourself or there's a bunch of companies out there that could do SDK generation. I'm trying to be a little agnostic about how I talk about it. I don't want to be too much of a README stan. But what I really like about when it's the SDKs tied to the documentation though, is like, it doesn't feel kind of like a foreign thing because SDKs kind of have a different ergonomical feel to using them than actual API does. APIs tend to be very like low level and like heavy on things like headers and body params and query params, stuff like that. Whereas SDKs are more like, hey, just send us some information. So there always is a bit of a disconnect unless you put a lot of care into it, where the API documentation is a little untethered from the SDK. And even though they do the same thing, they just ergonomically feel very different. So you end up like reading documentation that doesn't really fit the same metaphor as the SDK. So if you're gonna do SDKs, no matter whether you build it yourself or use a firm or something, or use README, definitely try to make sure that it's integrated super well. Otherwise it kind of feels like a very disjointed experience. Obviously, by the way, everything I'm showing here is not README. This is just a quick little API mock-up doc that I made, just to kind of show the different concepts. All right, last thing I want to talk about is, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to get through this quickly, is errors should move the developers forward. So one thing I found about API errors, I said we weren't going to touch the API, but this is a slight exception where you can layer new things on top of the API error responses without there being an issue. You can't change the parameters, but you can always add more stuff to it. So one thing I've noticed about errors is that they tend to tell you what you did wrong, but they don't tell you how to fix it or what to do next. And that's always really frustrating because like you make a request and you get a response back that says like, oh, your API key is invalid, or, oh, you did this wrong. And you're like, okay. And it just feels like, you've hit a wall and you're like, now I've got to figure out how to get past this. And that's kind of frustrating. Whereas like, if you think about errors more as like, if you're bowling and, when you throw a ball down, it hits the gutter and like, you're like, okay, I guess I got to start over and try again and like, try again. It's kind of like those bumpers that you can get in bowling where rather than like going into the gutter and like, losing, it bounces back into the center, and like the gutter blockers like kind of just keep the ball kind of in the center moving. And your errors should do the same thing, rather than just being a hard stop and being like, nope, that's wrong. Your errors should kind of bump you in the right direction, and they should be seen less as like angry, oh no, I hit a wall, and more like, oh, this is a helpful next steps. So right here, like, messages, you kind of have a message, you might say something like, this is not working or whatever. So the two things that I would always add to your API responses, first is help. So the first is help, or what's next, or whatever you want to call it, but a plain English statement and what's due next. Because for you making the API, it's really obvious that, oh, this API key is invalid. It could be, you're just telling them the API key is invalid, but why is it not invalid? Or why is it not valid? Maybe it's because it expired. So you should put that in the help message. Maybe they expire every 60 days. Maybe you have to go to a different URL to get it. Include the URL right in the help thing so they can go get it. Like this like next steps help portion should always move the user forward and get them to the next step. So it's like kind of, just like I said, bouncing them forward to that 200. And the second is always include a link to the docs. I think that it's kind of weird that you get a response and you're like, okay, there's an issue, and you have to like Google to find the error or like try to find it. Like, why not just link directly to the documentation that's relevant to that endpoint? And there's also bonus points if you can link directly to the log. So I was showing before that we have the logs inside of like the docs before in our previous slide. Like, why not link directly to the log so you can like examine in the UI what's going wrong and see like little notifications that are like, oh, the error is this or whatever. And then email support and be like, hey, here's my log, what's going wrong? And like support could be like, oh, I see the problem, you messed this up. So the two things to add to your errors is help thing, which just says, here's what to do next to kind of keep them moving forward. And second is a link to the docs so that they don't have to Google or anything else. Like, it just feels like a very cohesive, smooth experience. All right, so I think this one's going to work. We'll see, I could be wrong, but let's see if we can make API requests again. So if you're on readme.dev, in a second, it's gonna reload, and it's gonna use nicer docs that bring in everything we just talked about, and we're gonna see how quickly people can make a successful 200 request. And go.
Hey there, future me again. Okay, so if you're playing along, you would see this UI with all the things we talked about being layered on top of it. You would click this, you'd say, hello, Greg. You'd hit try it now. And you had just made your first request. Easy peasy. All right, back to the talk.
Okay, so I was waiting for logs. It should be working, seems to be working. Okay, we got a bunch of requests. Okay, so a bunch of people did it in like 20 seconds or so. So we went from, hey, Rachel and Olivia and hello and M. We went from it taking a very long time to IRB, hello. We went from it taking, again, didn't work, unfortunately, but no one would have been able to make an API request a few minutes ago. It would have taken like 2 or 3 minutes and you wouldn't have gotten very far because you were just chasing around grabbing stuff. But kind of with the updates that we just made, where we like layered on real stuff and let people play around, all of a sudden we made documentation that was super easy to use and everyone was able to make an API request. I'm gonna out Olivia here, who made a request. She was at my talk last week in person, and she was like, "This is the first API request I ever made." She's not a developer. She was marketing, but she was excited that she could like make an API request and stuff like that. And that's a great feeling. Like, it feels kind of magical when you can make an API request pretty easily, and you didn't just spend 2 hours like struggling against and trying to get it work. Like, it just kind of worked. So that's all I got. Thank you everyone for coming. I'll stick around for a second and answer questions if there are any. But feel free, like I said, you don't have to use README for any of these things I just said. A lot of great API docs have built this up themselves and all that. But if you want all those features magically for free, README does all of them and a bunch more. So definitely feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more, whether about using README or just in general. I'm always happy to talk.